message is called Turning Point. Turning Point. Start with a question. What is the worst day of your life? At least so far, because you have not been alive that long to have that many worst days.
The day I was born.
What is the worst day of your life? You don't remember the day
I
you were
found out
born.
my cousin was dead.
The day you found out a loved one died, perhaps. What is the worst
The
day
I cracked the camera.
of your life?
The day I realized uni is a scam. Yeah.
The day you work to the reality of life. Right? Maybe it was the day that your loved one passed away, a cousin or a grandfather or a grandmother. Maybe it's the day that you found out a close friend of yours betrayed the trust that you had in them. Maybe
Also,
it was the day that you found out you could not get into the course or the job that you have worked so hard for. Maybe it's the day you realized that your cat no longer loves you and never really did love you anyway. Maybe it was the day that BTS came to Singapore and you couldn't get tickets.
Nobody wants to go to their concert anyway. There's people sitting
So it's not your worst day, but I'm sure it was somebody's worst day.
Oh, okay.
Right? So whatever your worst day was, I want you to think back. Don't get traumatized, but think back on that worst day, the day that your heart was broken, the day that everything came crashing down, the day the earth opened up and swallowed you in.
Like in 2012.
Think back on that day. Keep those thoughts that you had, keep the kind of emotions that you felt on that day in your mind as we look at today's passage. Because today we're going to look at an account of a lady by the name of Mary Magdalene. And she, right now, is going through the worst possible moment of her life. Right? The worst possible moment of her life. Who is Mary Magdalene? Now, Mary Magdalene was a disciple of Jesus. She isn't one of the 12 apostles, but she is as much as a disciple as any one of them, because you don't need a title to follow Jesus. There were quite a number of women in Jesus' ministry that was very important, and they played a very important role, because these women believed in Jesus, they followed him, and then the Bible also tells us that they supported his ministry out of their own pockets, right? So they were benefactors, and they gave towards the ministry of Jesus. And unlike the culture of that day, at that point of time where people were looking down on the role of women, Jesus, on the other hand, empowered women, and he allowed them to play an active role in his ministry because he believed in standing up for women, because he created them as equals, right? He created them as equals to men. And so Jesus stood up for women's rights. And feminists should be Christians.
Yes. Yay.
But anyway, there were a group of women that played a very important role in Jesus' ministry. Mary Magdalene was one of them. Just some fun facts. Magdalene is not a surname. If you thought Mary Magdalene was a surname, I'm sorry to burst your bubble. It is not a surname, it's the place that she was from. Right? So she was from a place called Magdala. And so she became Mary of Magdala, or Mary Magdalene. She is also not a prostitute. People get her mixed up with someone else, thinking that she is the prostitute. Right? And she is not the Mary that is the sister of Martha and Lazarus. That is a completely different Mary. Right? There are lots of Marys in the Gospels, and it's super easy to get them mixed up, but that is not Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is not the Mary of the sister of Martha and Lazarus. She's not the one that always sat at Jesus' feet. She is Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene. What we do know about Mary Magdalene is this, right? The Bible tells us that Jesus cast out many demons from her. And so likely, Jesus also healed her of the kind of afflictions that demons would typically bring when they possess someone. And so Jesus changed Mary Magdalene's life. And as a result of that change, then Mary Magdalene decided that she was going to follow Jesus. And so that's what she did. For 3 years of her life, she believed in Jesus, she supported Jesus, she listened and obeyed Jesus' teachings, and she placed all her hope in Jesus. But then we find one day, one night, one Friday, or rather Thursday night, everything goes wrong. Everything goes wrong for Mary Magdalene because the religious leaders came and they captured Jesus And they accused Jesus, falsely accused him, and they got him crucified on a Roman cross. And now we find Jesus is dead, and he is lying in someone else's tomb. So imagine if you were in Mary's shoes. Imagine if you were the one who absolutely believed in Jesus, and you believed Jesus was the Messiah, you believed Jesus was the chosen one of God, and you invested all your life into following Jesus and obeying him, and you absolutely had faith that God was going to restore the kingdom through Jesus. Only to find that now it's all over. And the dream, it appears, is dead. Because Jesus is dead, and he's in a tomb. There are moments in your life where you have really bad days, right? But there is good news, because the Bible tells us that God works all things out for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So really, when it comes to God, he can take your worst days and he can turn it around to make it your best days. Your worst moments can simply be a turning point for your life. And so that's what we're going to look at happen to Mary Magdalene. We're going to read John chapter 20, starting with verse 1. Verse 1 says, "On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark." Right? So the sun had not risen. Mary goes to the tomb while it was still dark. But there's something else very unique about John's gospel, because John likes to play with contrast. He likes to play with light and darkness in more than one way. So when he talks about it being light, or he talks about it being dark, he's not just talking about the time of the day. He's also giving us a glimpse into how things are spiritually for the person involved. So for example, in John's Gospel, very early on, you read this account where there is a religious leader called Nicodemus, and he has a lot of questions about Jesus. He's not really quite sure what to make of Jesus. And so he comes to Jesus in the night. In the night, right? Because he's not exactly sure yet, and he's still in spiritual darkness because he cannot discern the identity of Jesus Christ. Contrast, or conversely, there is a woman at the well that meets Jesus at the well. And she meets Jesus when it is
Thirsty.
day. When it's thirsty. No, she was.
Yes, she wants water.
Yes, she wanted water, but she met Jesus during the daytime when it was still light, because she was going to have her eyes open and she is going to find out who Jesus is, that he is God's Messiah. Right? So John likes to play with this kind of contrast, and he's giving us a glimpse into the spiritual state of the people involved when he talks about them. So we find out that Mary comes to the tomb and it is dark, because that's the state that Mary is in. She is in spiritual darkness, right? She's not a happy person at this time. But also strangely, you find that John is already hinting something, because he says, while it was still dark. He's giving us a clue that God's about to do something, and God's going to turn things around for Mary. But before that happens, it's going to get worse. John chapter 20 says, she saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. And so Jesus' body is now gone. Right? Mary goes to the tomb. She goes to the tomb with the intention to mourn, to pay her last respects. But now she can't even do that because the body of Jesus is gone. And so Mary's worst day just got a lot more worse. What does Mary do? She will definitely cry. Just hang on. She does something else before she cries. Right? Verse 2, it says, she ran to Simon Peter and to the other disciple, that is John, the one that Jesus loved, so humble, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put him. So we find that Mary does something. She immediately encounters this great problem, this great difficulty, and then she runs to someone else. Right? She runs to go and find Peter and John to tell them what has happened. You have to ask the question, why would she do that? Why does she go and find Peter and John? Perhaps she didn't know what else to do. Perhaps she was expecting that they would be able to do something that she couldn't do. Perhaps she thought that they would emotionally relate to her and how she felt because women. But that's not going to happen, right? Because she is a female and then they are males and our brain is just not wired the same way. Trust me, I know. Jason, take note. Take note that the male brain is wired differently than a female brain. You think emotionally, we think logistically.
I think my friend's boyfriend's brain is wired like a female.
Okay.
Yeah, there are guys like that. That's so annoying.
That's like a unicorn. It's like a unicorn, it's a rare breed. Not that unicorns exist. Right?
They do, man!
No, they don't. So, whatever her reason for trying to go and find Peter and John, I think she was most likely expecting that they would be able to do something. That's why she follows them back to the tomb so that she can see what they actually do. Whatever it is, in the most desperate time, you find that she turns to someone else. She tries to run to Peter and John. And that's what we often do too. Same thing happens to us because it's a natural thing for us, right? We encounter a difficulty and then we want to turn and we want to depend on another person. If I'm having a bad day, I would naturally want to tell Anne and find some comfort in her words. Vice versa, if Anne is having a bad day, she will definitely let me know, right? And I'm sure that's what Ting does for Adele, and Adele does for Ting, and I'm sure that's what Jason does with Gerald, and what Gerald does for Ting, and what Eric does for Eric, because Eric is alone. But that's what we do. We tend to run to some other person with our troubles. And that's not a bad thing, right? That's not a bad thing that you go and find someone else that you can relate to and find some help and comfort from. But perhaps it should not be the first thing that we do. Perhaps in our worst moments, we shouldn't be so quick to run to another person, but we should be first able to run to God. Perhaps we should turn to Him first in prayer. Perhaps we should turn to God's Word first, to listen to what the Spirit has to speak to us in those moments. Because no matter who you have and who you are in relationship with, God is always the better option. Maybe if Mary had decided to turn to Jesus' words first, remembering what Jesus had said, then she would have realized that nobody stole Jesus' body. Jesus said He was going to rise again. And she would have remembered that and she wouldn't be so freaked out about this whole situation. But instead of turning to what Jesus says, she turns and she runs to Peter and John, who are as clueless as she is. So how does that work out for her? John chapter 20, verse 3. At that, Peter and the other disciple went out and headed for the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and got to the tomb first. Why is that significant?
He was more eager.
No, there's totally no significance to it. Right? It's totally not significant at all, other than the fact that as you grow older, you get slower. Because John was a young man and Peter was an old guy. Right? John was a millennial.
Really?
Peter was telling dad jokes.
I thought they were all the same age.
No, they were not. John was young. He continues, verse 5. So John reaches the tomb first. Verse 5, it says, he stooped down and he saw the linen clothing lying there. Yet he did not go in because John was cautious. Right? He reached the tomb first, saw that this is a strange sight. There's supposed to be a body there, there's no body there. The stone is supposed to be still in place, but now it's rolled away. And he's probably thinking to himself, I watched a movie about this. This is a trap. Right? I'm going in first because bad things happen to the person that goes in first. I'll let Peter go in first. Which is exactly what Peter does because that's in line with Peter's character. So it continues, verse 6, then following him, Simon Peter came also. He entered the tomb without any hesitation and saw that the linen clothing lying there. The wrapping had then been on his head, was not lying there with the linen cloth, but was folded up in a separate place by itself. Just so you know, Jesus is tidy, he's courteous, and so he cleans up after himself, and he makes sure all the clothing are all folded properly in its place, right? So remember that the next time you go to a food court that says, please return your tray. Verse 8. The other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, then entered the tomb, because Peter is still alive, the coast is clear, no death trap. And then he saw and he believed. For they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went home again. You would think after spending so long with Jesus and hearing Jesus repeatedly say to them, I'm going to the cross, I am going to die, and I'm going to rise again. It was no secret. Jesus repeatedly told them of the fact. You would think that they would have figured out what was going on even before this whole incident happened. But it appears that they did not understand at all what was going on, right? The verse tells us that they did not understand that the scripture said that Jesus must rise from the dead. They did not get it, despite of all time that they spent with Jesus. And sometimes we just don't get what God is trying to do in our lives. We just don't understand. You and I, we suffer from spiritual blindness sometimes that makes us unable to see what is really going on. Because in our worst moments, when we're going through a trial, when we're going through a difficulty, our eyes are only fixated on our problem. We're only fixated on what has gone wrong for us. But God does not see things the way that we see them. Right? God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are much higher than our thoughts. God does not just look at the moment. The Bible tells us that God sees the beginning from the end. So when we see our failure, God sees the lesson that we need to learn so that we can succeed. When we see the struggle, God sees the process by which we become more like Jesus. When we see our weakness, God sees the grace that He gives us that can overcome our weakness and bring us through. When we see death, God sees resurrection. So when you are going through a difficult moment, you need to know that's not how your story ends. Right? God is not done with you yet. And you might not see it right now. But wait a while. Hang in there. You see it in the end. All you need to do is put your hope in God, because a turning point is coming. And the turning point might come sooner than you think. So let's get back to Mary. Remember, it was Mary who ran to Peter and John. Peter and John came. They saw, and then the verse says they went home. Did they do anything? No, they did not do anything. Right? Where does that leave Mary? Now Jason has the answer. Verse 11, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. Because female, we process disappointment differently. Females cry. Males just want to go home and take a nap. This is typically the case.
She thinks she's a male. Same.
Good for you guys.
I will cry and then go and take a nap.
Let's cry first and then go home. This is how Mary ends up, right? Mary is left alone outside the tomb and she's crying. Well, she turns to Peter and John for help, but really they couldn't help her. Peter doesn't know what's going on. John has some kind of clue, he has some suspicions, but he doesn't really know whether he's right, and so he does not even say anything. Both of them didn't know what to do, and so they just went home. And that leaves Mary alone crying outside, looking at the tomb of Jesus. Has that ever been you? Have you ever been the one that has to face some struggle? Or you have been through some battles and you had to stand and face some kind of disappointment, and you find when you're facing all that, you're just alone. Right? The people that you thought would be by your side, they're not longer there. They can't help you because perhaps they're like Peter and John. They don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They have their own doubts. They have their own struggles, and they don't have the time to work on your problems because they have their own. sometimes we end up being alone. And that's just the way reality is. If I'm writing a term paper, Anne loves me, but she can't help me write that term paper. I am going to have to write it myself. And if Anne is facing some kind of problem at the cafe, some kind of recipe problem, right? I can love her, but I can't fix that recipe for her, right? I just don't have that ability to. We have to do these things alone, because people we find are always limited in what we can do. But I find this to be true also, that sometimes alone is exactly where God wants you to be. And sometimes it's on purpose and by God's design that you are facing this all alone, and you are looking at a tomb without anyone else. Because I find that when you are alone and you have no one else to depend on, and there's nothing else that you can do, that is the time that God meets with you, and that He comes to you and He reveals Himself in that moment of desperation. C.S. Lewis is famous for many things, but he's also famous for one of his quotes that he says. He has this quote where he says that God whispers in our pleasure, He talks in our conscience, but He shouts in our pain. And that's often the case where we find that God speaks to us the loudest, in the times where we are alone and we are facing disappointment, and we're facing the struggle, and we're facing a problem. And there have been many moments last year in ministry where I was at my wit's end, right? And I didn't know what else to do. And all I could really do was just cry out to God for His grace and His mercy, and trust and rely that He will do something that I cannot do. And you know what? God does not fail, right? He made the changes. He enabled things to turn around, and He did the things that I could not do. So when reality does not match your expectation, what you need to know that it's an opportunity also for God's revelation. That God wants to reveal Himself to you even in your worst days, so that you can see that He is more than enough for you. Now John chapter 20 is going to continue, but what follows is pretty strange. Verse 11, it says, as she was crying, she stood to look into the tomb. She saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet where Jesus' body had been lying. And they said to her, woman, why are you crying? Because they have taken away my Lord, she told them, and I don't know where they have put Him. Now this is really strange. This is really strange to me, because I have no idea how is it possible for Mary to be talking with angels and not realize it. She could have at least gone, wait a minute, right? I'm talking to angels. Angels don't appear every day. Something must be up. But instead, she is completely oblivious to their presence and who they are. And it's really strange, because this is not one of the times where the angels are coming in disguise. Right? Sometimes in the Bible, you find angels come in disguise, and they look like everyone else. This is not that case, because it says that they were wearing white. And so they are coming in their glory. They are coming in their heavenly form. And Mary is talking to them, but somehow she just misses it. She totally misses it. Right? She's looking at them, but she's not seeing them. All she really does see is the disappointment. The fact that Jesus' body is gone. All she sees is a pain. All she sees is her despair. And she's focusing on what is missing rather than what is there. To say it another way, Mary was looking at the tomb, but she fails to see that God is working in the tomb. And that's really how many of us are like. Because often we don't associate our tomb as the place where God is at work. Right? You don't think of your worst days as the day that God is working in your life. You think of the worst day as the day that God has abandoned you, or that God is absent, or God has forgotten about you. Right? You don't remember God's presence, or you don't think that God is working in the exam hall when you're writing your paper and you don't know how to answer the question. That's not the moment that you think God is at work with me right now. That's the moment you think I feel abandoned and I feel alone and God is not here, right? He's anywhere but here. we don't think of the tombs as the place that God is at work. But what if we're wrong? What if God is at work even in our worst moments? What if God's hand is moving and shaping our lives for His glory and there are angels in our tombs? We just don't see it. And the reason we don't see it is because we are looking at things with natural eyes. But when you want to see God at work, what you need is to look with eyes of faith. God is at work even in our worst days to turn things around, but often it requires you to view with eyes of faith. And only then can you discern His hand. There's this cool story in the Old Testament that comes from 2 Kings, chapter 6, verse 16 to 17. This is a story where the prophet of God has been surrounded by many enemies. And the servant of the prophet is freaking out and saying to Elijah, who is the prophet, "Master, what are we going to do? We're surrounded by many enemies." And then Elijah says, "Don't be afraid." Elijah told him, "For there are many more on our side than theirs." And then Elisha prayed, and he says, "Oh Lord, open his eyes and let him see." And the Lord opened the young man's eyes. When he looked up, he saw that the hillside around Elisha was filled with horses and chariots of fire. God was there, but the servant didn't see it. Elijah saw it because he viewed with eyes of faith. And maybe the prayer that we need to pray in our struggle is not that God takes it away. Perhaps it's first to pray that God open my eyes to see what you're doing. Open my eyes to see how you are at work in this situation and the things that I am going through. Help me to see your glory in this problem. Now the story gets even stranger. John chapter 20, verse 14. It says, having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, though she did not know it was Jesus. Verse 15 says, "Woman," Jesus said to her, "why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Supposing he was the gardener, she replied, "Sir, if you have removed him, tell me where you have put him, and I will take him away." Now this is very amazing, very strange, because I have no idea how this could possibly happen. Right? At the same time, I also think that if I was in Mary's situation, I would probably not fare any better. But it's really strange because Mary is looking for Jesus and Jesus is standing right there, but she does not know it's Him. How is it possible? How is it possible that Mary did not see Jesus?
She cried too much.
Maybe her eyes were too swollen, maybe they were filled with tears, maybe she was not paying attention.
She was too wrecked.
What I find is that perhaps it's because Mary expected Jesus to be dead, but Jesus appeared to her alive. See, she was not expecting Jesus to appear alive. She thought Jesus would appear to her as a lifeless body. She wasn't aware Jesus was with her because Jesus did not reveal Himself in the way that she had expected Him to. Rather, Jesus revealed Himself in a way that was far beyond her expectation. And sometimes that's the same case with us, because sometimes we miss the presence of God in our life because we have in our minds limited God to act a certain way. And we think God will act this way and no other way. God will do this and no other thing. But God is so much more, and He's so much further beyond our expectation. And the truth is, He is always with us, even when we fail to recognize that He is with us even in our worst days. Now, I was chatting online with Yaya the other day. She was having a stressful, hard time at school preparing for A-levels. And then she said she was at one moment questioning God, asking God, why was this happening to her? Right? And then she told me her story that the other day, one night, God gave her a dream, and in the dream, God encouraged her, and then she realized after that that, oh, God is with me, right? God is with me in this problem. And then she was telling me that, she's saying that now I know that God is with me, and so I can do this. I can face this problem. To which I told her, God is always with you. There is no point in time where God is not with you. And she was shocked. She said, really? As if this was some grand revelation, which made me wonder whether I said it enough. But that's the truth. God is always with us. There is no point of time where His presence is not with us. He says He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. Whether we recognize His presence or not is a different thing. But even if we don't recognize His presence, He is still there. Mary failed to recognize Jesus, but it does not mean Jesus was not with her. He is always with you. John chapter 20, verse 16, Jesus says, Mary, turning around, she says to Him in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. And so we find Jesus calls Mary's name, and Mary turns around. This is literally Mary's turning point. This is the turning point of Mary's situation. And of all the things that Jesus could have said at this moment, right? Of all the things that He could have said, surprise, it's me, I'm back, I told you I'll be back. Why did you guys remember what I told you? He could have said something to that, but instead what Jesus chooses to say is Mary's name. And He says, Mary. Because we serve a God who is personal. We serve a God who is near us. And you need to know that God knows you, and He knows you by your name. He knows you by your name. Right? He knows what you have been through. The fact that Jesus is saying, Mary, means, Mary, I know that your heart is broken, but I am now here. And Jesus calls you by your name. He says, Ting, I know you're worried about your studies, but I am here. Tells Eric, I know you're worried about your future and you have questions about what you're going to do, but I am here. And he tells Adele, I know you're worried about your provision, but I am here. And that's the fact about Jesus. He calls us by our name. Jesus calls Mary by her name so that she can know that He is with her. And today, if you're going through such a time, then you need to know that Jesus calls you by your name. He knows you. He knows what you have been through, and He is always there with you. God has not abandoned you. He is always right there beside you. God is not gone. He is here with you. Jesus is not dead. Jesus is alive. And if Jesus is alive, then neither is His faithfulness dead, neither is His promises to you dead, neither is the hope that you have in Him dead. Because the story of the Bible is that the grave will never have the last word. The grave will never have the last word, and so neither will your failures, neither will your fears, neither will your insecurities, neither will your sins, neither will what people say about you have the last word about your life, because the final word always belongs to Jesus. And what Jesus says is that He died for you, and that His grace is enough for you, and that He has a plan and purpose for your life, and that He promises to never leave you and forsake you. And He says that nothing will ever separate you from His love. And so if you have the faith to listen to His voice today, if you have the faith to believe, then you'll realize that even in your worst days, God is still at work. Even in your hardest moments, God is still right there. And since He's right there, He can turn things around. God can take what is dead and turn it back to life. God can take shattered dreams and put them back together. God can take a cross and turn it into a resurrection. That's the good news. Good news is that Jesus is alive. That's the news that we celebrate, especially on this weekend. Jesus restores Mary. But He's not done yet, because there's something else that He wants Mary to do. And we're going to end with this. John chapter 20, verse 17. He says, "Don't cling to me," Jesus told her, "for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." So Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said to her. Jesus tells Mary, "Mary, go and tell Peter and John, go and tell the other disciples, because they need to know what you now know to be true." See, when God changes your life, when God turns things around for you and He turns your worst days into your best days, that's not all that He's interested in. What God is also interested in is turning your mess into your message. He wants to turn your mistakes into your mission. He wants to take your tests and turn it into your testimony. And for some of you, God has brought you through some hard days. Don't hold that message in for yourself, because it's not just for you. Don't keep that news to yourself. But you need to go and you need to tell someone else what you now know, so that God can also do the same things that He has done for you in their life.